When James Maxwell III walked into that small downtown diner, he wasn't looking for love. He definitely wasn't looking for revolution. But in Sarah Chen, the waitress with fire in her eyes and 3 jobs under her belt, he found both. Some said their love was doomed. His father threatened disinheritance. Society whispered cruel judgments. But they were about to prove that true love doesn't just break barriers, it transforms worlds. The marble floors of the Maxwell estate echoed with the sound of raised voices, a rare occurrence in the typically serene mansion. James Maxwell III stood his ground in his father's study, his tailored suit doing little to shield him from the verbal onslaught. At 32, he had never seen his father, Richard Maxwell, so livid. "You cannot be serious, James!" Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "A waitress? Have you completely lost your mind? Do you have any idea what this will do to our family's reputation?" James ran his fingers through his dark hair, a nervous habit he'd developed in boarding school. "Her name is Sarah, father, Sarah Chen. And yes, I'm going to marry her." The antique desk between them might as well have been an ocean. Richard's fingers drummed against the polished mahogany, a steady rhythm that somehow made the tension even worse. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawling Maxwell estate, a constant reminder of everything James stood to lose. "I've spent 30 years building this empire," Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. 30 years of careful alliances, strategic partnerships, maintaining our family's position in society, and you want to throw it all away for some girl you met at a diner? "She's not just some girl," James felt his own anger rising. "She's brilliant, kind, and more genuine than anyone I've met in our social circles. She's putting herself through nursing school while working 2 jobs. Spare me the romantic drivel," Richard cut him off. "What about Caroline Hartford? Her father and I were this close to arranging." "I'm not a chess piece for you to move around, father. I'm 32 years old, and I'll marry whom I choose." The study door opened quietly, and Eleanor Maxwell glided in, her perfectly coiffed silver hair and Chanel suit a stark contrast to the emotional chaos in the room. "I could hear you both from the conservatory," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of old money. "James, darling, surely we can discuss this rationally." James turned to his mother, hoping to find an ally, but her eyes held the same disapproval as his father's, just better concealed beneath layers of social grace. "There's nothing to discuss, Mother. I love Sarah, and I'm going to marry her. I don't need your approval or your money." Richard's laugh was sharp and cruel. "My money? You think this is just about money? Everything you have, your education, your connections, your position at the company, it all comes from this family. Are you prepared to give it all up for this waitress?" "Yes," James said simply, and the single word seemed to echo through the room. Eleanor sank gracefully into a leather armchair, pressing her fingers to her temples. "James, you're not thinking clearly. What about children? Have you considered what it would mean to bring children into this situation? The social implications alone?" "The social implications?" James's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Heaven forbid the Maxwell heirs have a mother who worked for a living instead of spending her days at charity luncheons pretending to care about causes." "That's enough!" Richard slammed his hand on the desk. "You have a choice to make, son. Either end this ridiculous infatuation or consider yourself cut off. No trust fund, no position at Maxwell Industries, no inheritance, nothing." The threat hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. James looked around the study, taking in the old money wealth that surrounded him. The first edition books, the original paintings, the Persian rug that cost more than most people's cars. For the first time in his life, none of it meant anything to him. "Then I choose Sarah," he said quietly. "I choose love over money, happiness over status, and authenticity over pretense." "Get out!" Richard's voice was ice. "Get out of my house, and don't come back until you've come to your senses." Eleanor rose, reaching for her son. "James, please!" But James was already walking toward the door. He paused at the threshold, turning back one last time. "You know what's ironic? You both taught me to value integrity above all else, to stand up for what I believe in. I guess you never expected me to stand up to you." The door closed behind him with a soft click that felt more final than any slam could have. As James walked through the mansion's grand hallway for what might be the last time, memories flooded his mind. Christmas mornings by the giant fireplace, summer parties on the lawn, his father teaching him to play chess in the library. But stronger than all of those was the memory of Sarah's smile when he'd proposed last week, sitting on a park bench with a simple ring he'd chosen himself. Sarah was waiting for him in their agreed meeting spot, a small coffee shop several blocks from the Maxwell estate. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes immediately reading his expression. She wore her waitress uniform, having just finished her morning shift at the diner, and her long black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. To James, she had never looked more beautiful. "It didn't go well, did it?" she asked softly as he sat down across from her. James reached across the table and took her hands in his. They were slightly rough from work, so different from the manicured hands he'd grown up around. "No, it didn't. But I made my choice, and I don't regret it." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "James, I can't let you give up everything for me. Your family, your inheritance, your whole life." "You are my life now," he interrupted. "Everything else is just stuff. We'll figure it out together." But as they sat there in the coffee shop, both trying to be brave for each other, neither could ignore the mountain of challenges that lay ahead. James had never lived without wealth. Sarah had never known anything but struggle. They came from different worlds, spoke different languages of life, and now they would have to build a bridge between those worlds, or perhaps create an entirely new one of their own. That evening, they moved James's essential belongings into Sarah's tiny studio apartment in a part of town he'd never visited before today. The space was barely big enough for one person, let alone two, but Sarah had made it cozy with secondhand furniture and small touches of personality, potted plants on the windowsill, fairy lights strung across the walls, and photos of her family back in Malaysia. As James hung his designer suits next to Sarah's waitress uniforms in the cramped closet, reality began to sink in. He'd need to find a job, one that didn't rely on his family name or connections. They'd need to figure out how to survive on their combined income while Sarah finished nursing school. And somewhere in all of that, they'd need to plan a wedding that neither family would likely attend. Sarah was in the kitchen area, trying to make space in her mini fridge for James's groceries. "We can put your cooking stuff in that cabinet," she said, pointing. "Though I should warn you, the stove only works if you sweet-talk it first." James looked at the ancient appliance and smiled. "I've never actually cooked anything more complicated than toast." "Well, then it's time you learned," Sarah laughed, but there was a hint of worry in her voice. "There's a lot we both need to learn, isn't there?" James wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "We'll learn together. That's what marriage is about, right?" But that night, as they lay together on Sarah's small bed, both were awake long after midnight, their minds racing with uncertainties. James thought about his mother's words about children and social implications. Sarah worried about whether love really could conquer all the practical challenges they faced. Neither spoke their fears aloud, not wanting to burden the other with doubts. The next morning brought their first test. James's credit cards had all been canceled. His father had worked fast. Their joint account held only what James had managed to transfer before being cut off, and it wouldn't last long in the city. Sarah watched as he stared at his phone, reading the notifications from the bank. "I have some savings," she offered quietly. "Not much, but—" "No," James said firmly. "That's for your nursing school. We'll figure something else out." He spent the day updating his resume, removing all references to Maxwell Industries. Without his family name to open doors, his MBA from Harvard suddenly felt less impressive. Every job application asked for references, and he realized with a sinking feeling that most of his professional contacts would be reluctant to cross his father. Sarah came home that evening exhausted from a double shift at the diner, her feet aching, but her tip envelope full. She found James sitting at her small desk, surrounded by job search printouts. "Any luck?" she asked, kicking off her shoes. "A few promising leads," he said, trying to sound optimistic. "How was your day?" "The usual, though Mrs. Henderson left me an extra-large tip because she's so excited about the wedding." Sarah's face fell slightly. "She wants to know when it is, but I didn't know what to tell her." The wedding. They hadn't discussed it since James's confrontation with his parents. A traditional Maxwell wedding would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now they'd be lucky to afford a courthouse ceremony and dinner afterward. "We could wait," James suggested carefully, "until we're more settled." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, looking small and vulnerable in her diner uniform. "Do you want to wait?" "No, James said immediately. "I want to marry you as soon as possible. I want to give you the wedding you deserve." "All I need is you," Sarah said, but James could see the shadow of disappointment in her eyes. Like most girls, she'd probably dreamed of her wedding day. Now, those dreams were being sacrificed along with so much else. The following weeks tested them in ways neither had anticipated. James landed a junior position at a small investment firm, a significant step down from his former role, but it was a start. The salary was less than what he used to spend on suits in a month. Sarah picked up extra shifts at the diner while maintaining her nursing school schedule, often running on just a few hours of sleep. They learned to navigate their new life together. James discovered the art of bargain shopping and the satisfaction of cooking his own meals after several memorable disasters. Sarah taught him how to use public transportation and introduced him to the vibrant community in their neighborhood, something he'd never experienced in his isolated world of privilege. But there were hard moments too. James's sister Charlotte tried to visit once, sneaking away from their parents, but she was caught and subsequently forbidden from contacting him. Sarah's family, while more accepting, worried that she was making a mistake. Her mother's concerned phone calls from Malaysia often left her in tears. The social divide became apparent in unexpected ways. At a dinner with Sarah's friends from nursing school, James accidentally offended everyone by suggesting they all go to an expensive restaurant, forgetting that not everyone could afford such luxuries. At his new workplace, colleagues who had grown up working class were initially suspicious of him, assuming he was another entitled rich kid playing at being normal. Their worlds collided in other ways, too. James's former friends from his social circle either ghosted him or treated Sarah with condescending politeness on the rare occasions they met. Sarah's co-workers at the diner, while friendly, sometimes made jokes about James's privileged background that hit closer to home than they realized. Yet, through it all, their love deepened. They discovered new sides to each other. James's hidden talent for fixing things around the apartment, Sarah's gift for making people feel instantly at home. They learned to laugh at their mistakes and celebrate small victories, like finding an amazing deal at the grocery store or managing to save a little money at the end of the month. One evening, about 3 months after James had left his family, they were walking home from the subway when they passed the Maxwell building, its gleaming windows reflecting the sunset. James's father's office was on the top floor, and he'd spent countless hours there learning the family business. Now, he was just another face in the crowd below. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. James looked down at her, remembering the look on his father's face when he'd walked out. He thought about his mother's charity events and his sister's sad texts before she was forbidden to contact him. He thought about his old office with its view of the city and his empty trust fund and all the plans his parents had made for his life. Then he looked at Sarah with her gentle smile and determined spirit, who worked harder than anyone he'd ever known, who made him want to be better, who loved him not for his name or his money, but for himself. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. It was an email from his mother. James stared at his phone, his hand trembling slightly. Eleanor's message was brief but loaded with meaning. "Your father is very ill. Please come home. We need to talk." Sarah read the message over his shoulder, her grip on his hand tightening. "You should go," she said softly. "We should go," James corrected her. "You're my family now. We face everything together." The next morning, they stood at the gates of the Maxwell estate. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple blue sundress she'd bought on sale, while James had put on one of his old suits, though it felt strange now after months of casual wear. The guard recognized James immediately, but hesitated when he saw Sarah. "It's all right, George," James said firmly. "She's with me." The walk up the curved driveway felt longer than James remembered. Sarah gasped softly at the magnificent gardens, now in full spring bloom. James realized she'd never seen the estate before. All their previous meetings had been in the city. Eleanor Maxwell was waiting at the front door, looking exactly as James remembered, though perhaps a bit more tired around the eyes. Her gaze flickered over Sarah briefly before settling on her son. "James," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Thank you for coming." She paused, then added with visible effort, "Hello, Sarah." "Mrs. Maxwell," Sarah replied politely, her accent slightly more pronounced due to nervousness. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet. James led Sarah through the marble foyer, past priceless artworks and antiques that now seemed unnecessarily ostentatious to him. His mother led them to the same study where he had had his confrontation with his father months ago. Richard Maxwell sat in his leather chair, looking smaller than James remembered. His face was gaunt, and his normally immaculate appearance showed signs of neglect. A nurse stood discreetly in the corner, monitoring equipment James hadn't noticed at first glance. "Father," James said, his voice catching slightly. Richard looked up, his sharp eyes taking in his son and Sarah. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Richard gestured weakly to the chairs across from him. "Sit," he commanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. As they sat, James noticed Sarah automatically reaching for his hand, then stopping herself, unsure of the protocol. He grabbed her hand anyway, intertwining their fingers deliberately. "The doctors say I have 6 months," Richard said without preamble. "Maybe less." James felt the floor shift beneath him. Despite their differences, despite everything, this was his father. Sarah's hand tightened around his. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Maxwell," Sarah said softly, her voice full of genuine compassion. Richard's eyes snapped to her, studying her properly for the first time. "Are you? Even after I tried to destroy your relationship with my son?" "Of course I am," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "No one should have to go through this, and despite everything, you're James's father." Something flickered in Richard's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant respect. Eleanor, standing by the window, turned to watch the exchange with sharp interest. "James tells me you're studying to be a nurse," Richard said after a moment. "Yes, sir. I'll graduate next year." "And you're working 2 jobs to pay for it?" "3, actually," Sarah corrected him. "I picked up some weekend shifts at a pharmacy." James turned to her in surprise. She hadn't told him about the 3rd job. She'd been leaving early on Saturdays, saying she was studying at the library. He suddenly understood why she'd been looking so exhausted lately. Richard's expression was unreadable. "Why didn't you take my son's money? He offered to pay for your education, didn't he?" "Because I've worked for everything I have," Sarah replied simply. "I'm not about to stop now, especially not with James struggling to rebuild his career. His savings need to last until he's established in his new job." Eleanor made a small sound by the window. James couldn't tell if it was approval or disdain. "And what about children?" Richard pressed, echoing Eleanor's concerns from months ago. "Have you discussed how you'll manage?" "We have," James interrupted, but Sarah squeezed his hand. "We want children eventually," she said calmly, "when we can provide for them properly, not just with money, but with time and attention. I grew up with very little materially, Mr. Maxwell, but with parents who were always there, who taught me the value of hard work and education. Any children James and I have will learn those same values." The room fell silent. Richard leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly. The nurse stepped forward, checking something on the monitors, but he waved her away. "Do you know why I built all this?" he asked suddenly, gesturing at the mansion around them. "Why I worked so hard to maintain our family's position?" Nobody answered, but he continued anyway. "My father was a factory worker. He died young, leaving my mother to raise 3 children alone. I swore my children would never know that kind of hardship." He looked directly at James. "Everything I did, every alliance I made, every bridge I built, it was all for you and Charlotte." "I know, Father," James said quietly. "But maybe the best thing you gave us wasn't the money or the connections. Maybe it was watching you build something from nothing. That's what I'm trying to do now, just in my own way." "With a waitress?" Richard's old scorn crept into his voice. "With a woman who understands both struggle and success," James corrected him. "Someone who knows the value of hard work and isn't afraid of it. Someone who makes me want to be better, to build something meaningful, not just inherit it." Eleanor moved from the window to stand behind Richard's chair, placing her hand on his shoulder. Sarah watched the gesture with interest. It was the first sign of genuine affection she'd seen between James's parents. "The company," Richard said abruptly. "The board is concerned about succession. Without you—" "I'm not asking to come back," James said. "That's not why we're here." "No?" Richard's eyebrow rose. "Then why did you come?" "Because you're sick," Sarah answered before James could. "Because you're family, even if you don't want me to be part of it. Because some things are more important than pride or money or social status." Richard stared at her for a long moment, then began to laugh. A weak, wheezing sound that made the nurse step forward in concern. But he waved her away again. "You know," he said, looking at Sarah with new eyes, "I said something very similar to my first wife's parents when they objected to our marriage. Did you know that, James? Your mother was my second wife." James shook his head, stunned. This was a part of his father's history he'd never heard before. "She was from old money," Richard continued. "I was a scholarship student at Harvard Business School, working 3 jobs myself. Her parents threatened to disown her." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "She died 2 years after we married. Cancer. I threw myself into building the business after that, determined to prove her parents wrong about me. Somewhere along the way, I suppose I became exactly like them." Eleanor's hand tightened on his shoulder. Sarah leaned forward, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she noticed Richard's increasing pallor. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time," she suggested gently. "You look tired, Mr. Maxwell." Richard nodded, seeming to deflate slightly in his chair. But as James and Sarah stood to leave, he spoke again. "Wait." He looked at his wife. "Eleanor, would you get the box from my desk?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then moved to the massive desk, opening a drawer and removing a small wooden box. She handed it to Richard, who held it out to James. "Your grandmother's ring," he said quietly. "I thought, for the wedding. If you haven't already—" James stared at the box in his father's trembling hand. The ring inside had been a Maxwell family heirloom for 4 generations. He remembered seeing it on his grandmother's finger as a child, how it would catch the light during their Sunday dinners. "We haven't set a date yet," Sarah said softly, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. "With everything that's happened—" "Take it," Richard insisted, his voice stronger now. "Consider it. Consider it a step toward understanding each other." As James accepted the box, Eleanor cleared her throat. Perhaps we could help with the wedding arrangements. Something small but proper. In the garden, maybe. The roses will be in full bloom next month." Sarah's eyes widened. James could see her fighting back tears. They'd been planning a courthouse ceremony, followed by dinner at the diner where they'd met. Her parents wouldn't be able to afford the flight from Malaysia for anything more elaborate. "Actually," Sarah said carefully, "my mother, she's been saving for a ticket, but with the exchange rate—" "We'll fly them in," Eleanor said quickly, then looked at Richard for confirmation. He nodded slightly. "First class. And they'll stay here, of course. There's plenty of room." James felt Sarah's hand trembling in his. He knew what this meant to her, not the luxury of first-class flights or the grand estate, but the chance to have her family present for her wedding, to bridge the vast gap between their worlds. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time she couldn't stop the tears. Richard watched them with an unreadable expression. "James," he said suddenly, "the company—" "Father, I meant what I said. I'm not asking to come back." "Let me finish." Richard's voice had an edge of his old authority. "The company needs new blood, fresh perspectives. We've become stagnant, set in our ways." He paused, gathering strength. "There's a position opening in our community outreach division. Entry level, no special treatment. You'd have to work your way up, prove yourself." James felt his heart skip a beat. Community outreach had always been his passion, the part of the business he'd wanted to expand. His father had always dismissed it as a necessary PR expense rather than a genuine mission. "The board won't like it," Richard continued. "They'll say I'm showing favoritism despite everything, so prove them wrong, both of you." "Both of us?" Sarah asked, confused. "We fund several nursing scholarship programs," Eleanor explained. "Programs that could benefit from someone who understands the challenges firsthand, someone who's lived them." The implications slowly sank in. This wasn't just an olive branch to James. It was an acknowledgement of Sarah's worth, of the perspective she could bring to the family business. "Of course," Richard added, his voice growing weaker. "That's after you finish your nursing degree. No shortcuts. You'll have earned it, just like everything else." The nurse stepped forward again, more insistently this time. "Mr. Maxwell needs to rest now." As they prepared to leave, Eleanor touched Sarah's arm. "Stay for dinner? There's so much to discuss. The wedding, your family's travel arrangements." Sarah looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. "We'd like that," she said. As they followed Eleanor out of the study, James glanced back at his father. Richard had closed his eyes, looking exhausted, but somehow more at peace than James had seen him in years. In the hallway, Sarah stopped suddenly, pulling James aside. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "Working at the company again, letting them plan the wedding. It's a lot of control to give back to them." James understood her concern. After fighting so hard for their independence, were they just falling back into old patterns? "It's different this time," he said slowly. "They're not trying to control us. They're trying to understand us. And maybe we need to try to understand them too." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. "Your mother's going to be shocked when she finds out I want a small wedding anyway. All those society connections, and I just want our families there. Well, and Mrs. Henderson from the diner. She'll never forgive me if she's not invited." James laughed, pulling her close. "We'll find the balance," he promised. "Between their world and ours. We'll make our own way." As they walked toward the dining room, the sound of classical music drifted through the mansion, but mixed with it was the distant sound of the city beyond the gates. Car horns, street vendors, the rhythm of the working world Sarah came from. Somehow, the combination didn't sound discordant anymore. Eleanor was waiting for them, phone in hand. "I've taken the liberty of calling my wedding planner," she said, "just to discuss possibilities, of course. And Sarah, dear, I thought you might want to call your mother with the news about the travel arrangements." James watched as Sarah took the offered phone, her eyes bright with happy tears as she dialed the international number. Yes, they would find their balance, not just between rich and poor, but between pride and forgiveness, between holding firm and knowing when to bend. The Maxwell estate had stood for generations, its gates keeping the world out. But now those gates were opening, not just to let Sarah in, but to let new ideas, new perspectives, and new definitions of success flow both ways. In Richard's study, the nurse was helping him to bed. He paused at the window, watching his son and future daughter-in-law in the garden below. They were sitting on a bench, Sarah animatedly talking to her mother on the phone, while James watched her with obvious adoration. "Sir?" the nurse asked. "Do you need anything else?" Richard shook his head slowly, still watching the scene below. Perhaps he was remembering another young couple, decades ago, facing their own battles against family expectations and social prejudices. Perhaps he was seeing the future of his company, his legacy, transforming into something he'd never imagined. Or perhaps he was simply watching two people in love and finally understanding that some things truly were more important than pride or tradition or carefully laid plans. The weeks leading up to the wedding transformed the Maxwell estate in unexpected ways. Sarah's parents arrived early, bringing with them the warm chaos of a Malaysian Chinese household. The formal dining room, usually reserved for business dinners, now filled with the aroma of her mother's cooking, as she insisted on teaching the kitchen staff traditional recipes. James discovered his future father-in-law, a retired mechanic, had an encyclopedic knowledge of classic cars. They spent hours in the estate's garage, where Mr. Chen helped James restore an old Mercedes that had belonged to his grandfather. It was the first time James had ever worked with his hands, and the pride he felt when the engine finally purred to life was different from any business success he'd ever experienced. Eleanor Maxwell, initially stiff and formal with the Chens, found herself drawn into long conversations with Sarah's mother about their children. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, both women shared the same hopes and fears for their children's happiness. One evening, James overheard them looking at old photos together, his mother actually laughing as Mrs. Chen shared embarrassing stories about Sarah's childhood. The wedding preparations became a unique blend of cultures and traditions. Eleanor's initial grand plans were gently tempered by Sarah's simpler tastes, resulting in an elegant but intimate affair. The Maxwell Garden would host both a traditional Chinese tea ceremony and a Western exchange of vows. Mrs. Henderson from the diner insisted on baking her famous apple pie alongside the elaborate wedding cake. But beneath the surface of this harmony, challenges still simmered. The board of directors was divided over Richard's decision to bring James back, even in an entry-level position. Some members leaked stories to the press about family drama and succession disputes. Society gossips whispered about the Maxwell heir marrying beneath his station. Sarah faced her own struggles. Some of her nursing school friends became distant, suggesting she'd sold out by accepting the Maxwells' help. Her favorite professor pulled her aside one day. warning her not to let marriage to a rich man derail her career ambitions. One evening, about 2 weeks before the wedding, Sarah found James in his father's study, looking troubled. Richard had been moved to the hospital that morning after his condition worsened. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting beside him on the leather sofa. James handed her a tablet showing an article in the financial news. The headline read, "Maxwell Industries in Crisis. Heir's unconventional marriage raises concerns among investors." "They're saying the stock price has dropped since father announced my return," James said quietly. "They're questioning his judgment, suggesting his illness is affecting his decision-making." Sarah read through the article, her face darkening. "They called me a social climbing waitress," she noted, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm so sorry," James began, but Sarah shook her head. "No, I'm sorry. Your father took a huge risk bringing you back, and I'm becoming a liability to the company." "You're not a liability," a weak voice said from the doorway. They turned to see Richard in a wheelchair, Eleanor and a nurse hovering anxiously behind him. He'd insisted on coming home, against doctor's orders. "Father, you should be resting." James stood quickly, but Richard waved him off. "I've learned something these past few months," Richard continued, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "The world is changing. Old money, old ways of thinking, they're becoming obsolete. We need people who understand both worlds, people who aren't afraid to work hard and think differently." He gestured for the nurse to wheel him to his desk. "That's why tomorrow I'm calling a press conference. It's time to announce some changes at Maxwell Industries." "Father, you're not well enough," James protested. "Then you'll do it," Richard said simply. "You and Sarah." "Me?" Sarah looked startled. "But I'm not even part of the company." "Not yet," Richard smiled slightly. "But you will be. James, remember that nursing scholarship program we discussed? I want to expand it, create a whole foundation focused on education and healthcare accessibility. Who better to lead it than someone who's lived that struggle?" Eleanor stepped forward. "We've been discussing it," she said. "The foundation would partner with community colleges, teaching hospitals, workforce development programs. It's not just charity, it's investment in human potential." James stared at his parents. This was more than a job offer or an olive branch. This was them finally seeing what he'd seen in Sarah, not just the person she was, but what she represented. The potential for change, for growth, for bridging worlds that had been separate for too long. "The press conference," Richard continued, "will announce several things. First, the creation of the foundation, with Sarah as its future director once she completes her degree. Second, a new direction for Maxwell Industries, focusing on community investment alongside traditional business ventures. And third," he paused, reaching for a folder on his desk. "Third, this." Inside the folder was a draft of a new company structure. James scanned it, his eyes widening. The community outreach division wasn't just being expanded, it was being elevated to a core part of the business, with direct board representation. "Your position may be entry-level," Richard said to James, "but your path upward will be clear. Earn it, and in time, you'll lead not just the company, but a new way of doing business." Sarah took James's hand, reading the documents over his shoulder. "The board won't like this," she said carefully. "The board works for me," Richard's voice had a hint of its old steel. "And more importantly, the numbers work. Social responsibility isn't just good ethics, it's good business. We just needed someone to show us that." Eleanor moved to stand behind her husband's wheelchair. "We thought, well, it could be a wedding gift of sorts, not just to you both, but to the community, a way of honoring both your worlds." James felt Sarah's hand tighten in his. They looked at each other, years of future possibilities spinning out before them. It wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, criticism, countless challenges ahead. But together. The press conference was scheduled for the morning, before the wedding rehearsal dinner. The grand ballroom of the Maxwell building had been transformed into a media center, with cameras and journalists from every major network and financial publication. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Rumors about Richard Maxwell's health and the company's future had been swirling for weeks. James adjusted his tie nervously backstage. He'd given countless presentations before, but never with so much at stake. Sarah stood beside him, looking professional and poised in a simple navy suit, a far cry from her diner uniform, but still distinctly her own style rather than trying to mimic the designer brands favored by Maxwell executives. "Ready?" she asked softly, straightening his tie with practiced hands. Before he could answer, Charlotte, his sister, slipped into the room. She wasn't supposed to be there. Their parents still hadn't officially lifted their prohibition on contact, but some rules seemed less important now. "The board members are all here," she whispered, "and they don't look happy. I overheard Mr. Harrison talking about calling an emergency shareholders meeting." James nodded grimly. Theodore Harrison had been his father's closest advisor for decades, but he represented the old guard, the traditional way of doing business that they were about to challenge. Richard Maxwell insisted on making a brief appearance despite his weakened state. As he was wheeled onto the stage, the cameras flashed frantically, capturing the shocking image of the once powerful CEO, now visibly ill. But his voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the room. "Change," he began, "is inevitable. The question is whether we guide it or are swept away by it." The room fell silent as he introduced James and Sarah, presenting not just a succession plan, but a vision for the future of Maxwell Industries. As James took the podium, he saw Theodore Harrison's face darkening with each word about community investment and social responsibility. Sarah's portion of the presentation was meant to be brief, just an overview of the foundation's goals. But as she spoke about her own experiences, about the barriers facing working students and the untapped potential in communities like the one she came from, the room's energy shifted. Journalists who'd come expecting a dry corporate announcement found themselves captivated by her genuine passion and practical insights. "This isn't charity," she explained, her voice clear and confident. "It's investment in human capital. Every brilliant mind we help educate, every hard-working person we give an opportunity to, strengthens not just our company, but our entire economy." The questions afterward were relentless. How would this affect shareholder value? Was this a repudiation of Richard Maxwell's previous business philosophy? Wasn't this just an elaborate PR move to smooth over a socially questionable marriage? It was this last question that made James grip the podium tightly, but Sarah's hand on his arm steadied him. She stepped forward, meeting the journalist's skeptical gaze. "I've spent the last 4 years working multiple jobs to put myself through nursing school," she said calmly. "I understand value, hard work, and sacrifice. The real question isn't why Maxwell Industries is choosing this new direction. The question is why more companies aren't recognizing the competitive advantage of investing in people from all walks of life." After the press conference, Theodore Harrison cornered them in the executive corridor. His face was flushed with barely contained anger. "This is business suicide," he hissed. "You're throwing away decades of careful positioning in the market. And you," he turned to Sarah, "you may have fooled them with your pretty speeches, but I know what this is. Gold digging dressed up as social consciousness." Before James could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Ted." Eleanor Maxwell stood in the doorway, her expression glacial. "I believe your resignation letter is overdue. The security team will help you clear out your office." Harrison's face went from red to purple. "You can't." "I can," she said softly. "I've been on the board longer than you have, Ted. I just chose to stay quiet until now. That was my mistake. One I'm correcting." As security arrived to escort Harrison out, Eleanor turned to Sarah with a slight smile. "Well handled in there, dear, though I believe we have a rehearsal dinner to prepare for. Your mother's been terrorizing the kitchen staff all morning, trying to teach them the proper way to make char siu bao." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The Maxwell estate was transformed for the rehearsal dinner, with lanterns strung across the garden and tables set up under the stars. The scent of Chinese and Western dishes mingled in the air, as both families' cultures were honored. But amid the celebration, James noticed his father was missing. He found Richard in his study, watching the evening news coverage of the press conference. "The stock dropped 15 points, Richard said, without preamble. James felt his heart sink, but his father wasn't finished. "It'll drop more tomorrow, maybe next week too. Change is expensive, son." Richard turned to face him. "But for the first time in years, I'm proud of where my company is heading." "Our company," James corrected gently. Richard smiled weakly. "Yes, though I suspect your wife will be the one really running things before long. She has a better head for business than either of us." "She's not my wife yet," James reminded him. "Soon enough?" Richard's expression grew serious. I need you to promise me something, James. Promise me you'll never forget what these past months have taught us. About pride, about change, about what really matters. James felt tears pricking at his eyes. They both knew Richard probably wouldn't live to see the changes they had announced today come to fruition, but his legacy would be very different from what anyone had expected. I promise, James said softly. Outside, the garden was filled with laughter as Sarah's relatives taught Charlotte traditional Chinese drinking games. Mrs. Henderson from the diner was deep in conversation with one of the board members about small business development in their neighborhood. Worlds were colliding, barriers breaking down, new possibilities emerging. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be more resistance to overcome, more bridges to build, more lessons to learn. But as James helped his father back to the garden, where Sarah waited with a warm smile, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. The true test of their love hadn't been choosing between wealth and happiness. It had been finding a way to redefine both, not just for themselves, but for others. And that story was just beginning. The morning of the wedding dawned with a gentle summer breeze carrying the scent of roses through the Maxwell estate. The garden had been transformed overnight. Rows of white chairs lined the lawn, a traditional Chinese arch draped with flowers marked the ceremony space, and lanterns hung ready to be lit as day turned to evening. Sarah stood in what had once been James's childhood bedroom, now converted into a bridal suite. Her mother fussed with her dress, a unique design that blended Western and Chinese elements, ivory silk with delicate red embroidery. The Maxwell family's heirloom ring caught the morning light on her finger, sitting alongside the simple band James had given her that day in the park months ago. "Something's missing," Eleanor Maxwell said, entering the room with a large velvet box. She opened it to reveal a stunning pearl necklace. "These were my grandmother's, and her mother's before that. Now they're yours." Sarah touched the pearls gently. "Mrs. Maxwell, I couldn't—" "Eleanor," James's mother corrected. "And yes, you can. You've given our family something far more valuable than pearls. You've given us a future we couldn't see before." In another part of the mansion, James helped his father dress for the ceremony. Richard's health had deteriorated further, but he'd insisted on walking, or at least trying to walk, Sarah down the aisle alongside her father. It had been his idea, this sharing of duties, this symbolic joining of families. "The latest reports came in," Richard said as James adjusted his tie. "Stock's down another 10 points. "I know," James replied calmly, "and 3 of our biggest investors have threatened to pull out. But we've had inquiries from 2 major ethical investment funds. They're interested in our new direction, and the Scholarship Foundation has already received over 1,000 applications." Richard nodded approvingly. "You see what she's taught us? Sometimes you have to lose something to gain something greater." The ceremony itself was a blend of traditions, just like the couple it celebrated. Sarah's parents performed the traditional Chinese tea ceremony in the morning, with both families participating. James watched in awe as his usually reserved father accepted the tea with trembling hands and gave Sarah a red envelope containing what James knew was not just money, but the deed to a small property. A starter home for the newlyweds that was modest by Maxwell standards, but chosen with care in a neighborhood halfway between their 2 worlds. As the afternoon sun began to set, guests gathered in the garden. It was an unusual mix. Corporate executives sat beside diner regulars. Sarah's nursing school classmates mingled with society matrons, and somewhere in the crowd, Mrs. Henderson was probably still trying to convince everyone to try her apple pie before the fancy wedding cake. The string quartet began to play, not the traditional wedding march, but a specially arranged piece that incorporated both Western classical music and Chinese melodic elements. Sarah appeared at the garden path, one arm through her father's, the other through Richard's. James felt his breath catch at the sight of her. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They had written their own vows, each promising not just to love and honor each other, but to continue building bridges, breaking down barriers, and working toward a world where stories like theirs wouldn't be considered unusual. At the reception, Richard Maxwell insisted on giving a speech despite his weakness. He stood shakily, leaning on his cane, and surveyed the diverse crowd before him. "When James first told me he was in love with a waitress," he began, causing a ripple of nervous laughter, "I thought he had lost his mind. I was wrong. He had found his heart. and in doing so, help me find mine again." He turned to Sarah. "My dear, when you first came into our lives, I saw only what I was afraid of losing. Now I see everything we have gained. You haven't just joined our family, you've helped us redefine what family means." Raising his glass with a trembling hand, he continued, "To James and Sarah, may they continue to teach us all that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, that real class has nothing to do with social status, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is the courage to choose love over fear." As the evening progressed, barriers continued to dissolve. Charlotte was teaching Sarah's cousins the foxtrot, while they taught her Chinese pop dance moves. Eleanor and Mrs. Chen were comparing notes on their children's childhood mishaps. Even some of the board members were beginning to see the potential in their new direction, especially after talking with some of the scholarship applicants who'd been invited to the wedding. Later, as James and Sarah swayed together during their first dance, she whispered, "Do you remember what you said to me that first night in my tiny apartment? That we'd figure everything out together?" James smiled, pulling her closer. "I remember. We did figure it out, didn't we? Just not in the way we expected." "No," he agreed. "We did something better. Instead of choosing between our worlds, we're building a new one." The lanterns glowed softly in the summer evening, casting a warm light over the gathered guests. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the company's transformation, the foundation's launch, the ongoing task of bridging divides. But tonight was for celebrating not just their love, but the power of that love to spark change. As the music played and their families danced together under the stars, James and Sarah held each other close, knowing that their story wasn't just about a rich man and a poor woman finding love. It was about the courage to challenge expectations, the wisdom to see value beyond wealth, and the vision to imagine a world where such distinctions mattered less than the content of one's character. And somewhere in the garden, Richard Maxwell watched his son dancing with his new daughter-in-law, and saw not the end of an era, but the beginning of something far more precious, a legacy of love that would ripple out far beyond the Maxwell estate's gates, touching lives they hadn't even dreamed of yet. The true worth of their love would be measured not in the wealth they commanded or the social barriers they broke, but in the lives they would transform through their example of courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that love truly could build bridges across any divide. 1 year after the wedding, the Maxwell estate hosted another gathering. This time, it was for the first annual Maxwell Foundation Scholarship Awards. The garden where James and Sarah had exchanged their vows was now filled with hundreds of students, each with stories of struggle and determination that mirrored Sarah's own journey. Sarah, now officially Dr. Chen Maxwell, after completing her nursing degree, stood at the podium. Her clinical whites had been replaced by a professional suit, but she still wore the simple pearl necklace Eleanor had given her on her wedding day. The past year had brought changes no one could have predicted. Richard Maxwell hadn't lived to see this day. He had passed away peacefully 3 months after the wedding, but his final months had been filled with purpose as he worked alongside James and Sarah to lay the groundwork for the foundation. His last words to James had been, "You chose better than I ever could have." The company had weathered its transformation, though not without cost. Several major investors had indeed pulled out, and the stock had taken months to stabilize. But, as Sarah had predicted, new opportunities had emerged. The Maxwell Foundation's work had attracted partners who saw the value in their vision of corporate social responsibility. Today, Sarah addressed the crowd, "We're not just awarding scholarships. We're investing in dreams. Each of you has a story like mine, of working multiple jobs, of sacrificing sleep for study, of refusing to let circumstances define your future." In the audience, James sat between their mothers. Eleanor Maxwell and Mrs. Chen had become unlikely best friends, their shared experience of losing their husbands, Mr. Chen to a sudden heart attack 6 months ago, having brought them even closer. They were currently planning to start a grief support group for families in the community. Charlotte had surprised everyone by enrolling in nursing school herself, inspired by Sarah's example. She now sat with Sarah's former classmates, who had long since overcome their initial skepticism about the Maxwell family's transformation. The biggest surprise had come 2 months ago, when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. They hadn't planned it so soon, but as James said, some of the best changes in life came unexpectedly. The baby would be born into a world very different from the one its parents had known. A world where the barriers between social classes were slowly but surely beginning to crumble. When I married James Maxwell, Sarah continued, her hand unconsciously moving to her slightly rounded belly, many people thought it was a fairy tale. Poor girl marries rich man, lives happily ever after. But real happiness isn't about moving from one social class to another. It's about creating a world where such distinctions matter less than our common humanity. The foundation had already helped hundreds of students access education they couldn't otherwise afford. But, more importantly, it had created mentorship programs, connecting successful professionals from diverse backgrounds with ambitious young people who shared their drive but lacked their opportunities. James watched his wife with pride, remembering the waitress who had served him coffee with a side of unshakable dignity. She had changed him far more than he had changed her. Under her influence, Maxwell Industries was becoming known not just for its profit margins, but for its pioneering approach to corporate responsibility. The diner where they'd met was now part of a small business development program, with Mrs. Henderson serving as a mentor to other aspiring entrepreneurs. She still insisted on baking apple pies for all major Maxwell family events, including today's ceremony. As Sarah announced the scholarship recipients, each story echoed with familiar themes of perseverance and hope. A single mother working 3 jobs to study engineering, a former factory worker pursuing a degree in sustainable business practices, a refugee determined to become a doctor and serve his community. The Maxwell Foundation wasn't just giving them money, it was giving them what Sarah and James had given each other, the chance to prove that love, determination, and courage could overcome any social barrier. Later that evening, as they walked through the garden where their journey had taken so many turning points, Sarah paused by the rose bushes her father-in-law had loved so much. "Do you ever wonder," she asked James, "what your father would think of everything that's happened?" James touched one of the blooms gently. "I think he understood, at the end, that true legacy isn't about preserving the past. It's about nurturing the future, just like these roses need pruning to grow stronger." Sarah smiled, taking his hand and placing it on her growing belly. Speaking of the future, they stood together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the evidence of how love could transform not just 2 lives, but countless others. Their child would inherit not just the Maxwell name, but a new understanding of what that name could mean. The evening air carried the mingled scents of roses and Mrs. Henderson's apple pie, of tradition and change, of endings and beginnings. Above them, the first stars appeared, witnesses to a love story that had become something far greater than either of them had imagined. For in choosing love over tradition, courage over comfort, and growth over stagnation, they had written not just their own happy ending, but the beginning of many other stories yet to unfold. 8 months later, as cherry blossoms drifted across the Maxwell estate's garden, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. They named the boy Richard Chen Maxwell, after both grandfathers, and the girl, Hope Lee Maxwell, combining Sarah's grandmother's name with a promise for the future. The twins' naming ceremony brought together an even more diverse gathering than their wedding had. The Maxwell estate, once a symbol of exclusivity, had become a place where different worlds intersected and new possibilities took root. The guest list included scholarship recipients, business leaders, community organizers, and family from both sides, all equal participants in celebrating new life and new beginnings. Eleanor Maxwell, now a doting grandmother, had transformed the mansion's formal parlor into a colorful nursery, where Chinese zodiac animals danced on the walls alongside traditional English nursery rhymes. She spent her days dividing time between the babies and her work with the foundation, having found a new purpose in continuing Richard's legacy of transformation. The twins' birth marked not just a new generation of Maxwells, but a living embodiment of the bridge their parents had built between 2 worlds. Little Richard had Sarah's dark eyes and James's wayward curl, while Hope had James's blue eyes and Sarah's gentle smile. They were, in every way, a perfect blend of both their heritages. On the twins' first night home, James found Sarah in the nursery, watching their sleeping children. She held Richard's old pocket watch, which Eleanor had given her that morning. "Your father told me once that time was the greatest equalizer," she said softly. "Rich or poor, we all have the same 24 hours in a day. It's what we choose to do with that time that matters." James wrapped his arms around her, careful not to wake the babies. "And what do you think we should do with our time?" Sarah smiled, placing the pocket watch on a shelf between a jade Buddha from her parents and a silver rattle that had belonged to James's grandmother. "Keep building," she said simply. "Keep showing the world that love doesn't just cross boundaries, it erases them." The Maxwell Foundation had grown beyond their initial dreams, now operating in multiple cities and helping thousands of students. But more importantly, it had sparked a movement. Other companies were following their model, recognizing that social responsibility and business success could go hand in hand. The story of the waitress and the heir had become more than a modern fairy tale. It had become a blueprint for change. James looked at his sleeping children, thinking of the world they would inherit. Not a world divided into rich and poor, high class and low class, but one where the only meaningful measure of worth was the good one did with the opportunities given. "My father once told me that everything he built was for his children," James said quietly. "I finally understand what he meant. Everything we've built, the foundation, the new direction for the company, the bridges between communities, it's all for them. Not just our children, but all the children who will grow up believing that love really can conquer any divide." Sarah took his hand, and together they stood, watching their twins sleep. These precious symbols of unity, of barriers broken, of love triumphant over prejudice and pride. Outside, the cherry blossoms continued to fall, covering the ground in a blanket of pink and white, nature's own celebration of beauty that knows no class distinctions. And so, their story became not just about a rich man who married a poor woman, but about the power of love to transform not just two lives or two families, but an entire community. It became a testament to the truth that real change begins with a single choice. The choice to see beyond the artificial boundaries that divide us, to recognize the worth in every human heart, and to believe that love, in its purest form, is the greatest force for change in the world. For in the end, it was not wealth or status that defined them, but the courage to choose love over fear, understanding over prejudice, and hope over tradition. Their legacy would live on, not just in their children or their foundation, but in every life touched by their example, in every bridge built between divided worlds, and in every heart open to the possibility that true love knows no boundaries. And that, perhaps, is the greatest inheritance of all.